So I'm Julie Miller, and I work for the English community organization CASE in the Mauricie Centre, Quebec. And I'm here with my friend today.
François from Nicolet. I was born not so far from here, right across the street in the Nicolet Hospital.
And you're a historian.
A long time ago.
It was a very long time ago.
I'm an artifact.
An artifact, but not as long ago as Kenelm Conor Chandler.
Of course, when I was a kid, I used to hear about Chandler because his cemetery was still here. Part of his domain was here. The ruins of his manor were here. And so he was part of the local history, but still it was marginal because there was no, except for some material remnants, there was nothing left to remind us of the Anglophone presence in Nicolet.
And that's what we're doing here today. We are in the old English Protestant cemetery, which is surrounded by these beautiful, really old trees, old pines, old maples, about 200 years old. And we're in the cemetery, which holds just a few stones, but there was once 90 or more people buried here. Once, I say once, there still are. The stones are gone. And we're right beside the grave of Seigneur Chandler, Ken Chandler, who bought the Nicolet seigneury in 1821. And it was quite a scandalous thing. There's two scandals actually associated with him. One during his lifetime and one decades after he died. But let's talk about the one during his lifetime. And what was the scandal?
The scandal was that he got in trouble with the local rector of the parish.
He got in trouble? That's a scandal. The scandal was that he was Protestant. He was the first Protestant seigneur in Nicolet.
Because he was a Protestant, he had problems with the local rector, who was Abbé Raimbault. And Abbé Raimbault was in a very uncomfortable position regarding the British power in Lower Canada, because as a priest he was a loyalist. Of course, he was loyal to the British crown because it was given by God. This is the order that was God's will to be in a British regime. But on the other hand, he was not very open to share the religious activities with the Protestants.
To share, he was terrified of the Protestants, Curé Raimbault. He was really scared about it. So the whole thing started with a dispute shortly after Chandler arrived. And it's very well known in French circles. It's called La Querelle du Pain Béni, which I would call the infamous dispute of the Holy Host. And what happened was there were no, like, Chandler arrived 1821, 1822 with his wife Jane Grant. They had one child, one daughter, and Mrs. Chandler, the seigneur's wife, turned up at the Catholic Church for communion. And there was a traditional bench for the seigneur in the church, and she went to sit in that place of honor and expected to be served communion. And Curé Raimbault walked right past her. Oh, so she went home, told her husband, and he thought, well, it must have been a mistake, Jane. Don't get all riled up. Don't be silly. Go back next Sunday. So she did. And Curé Raimbault walked right past her a second time because she was a Protestant heretic. Anyway, so Chandler wrote letters to the bishop and so on, and it was a serious dispute.
Of course, at the scale of this small community, it was a major dispute. But you must remember that Raimbault was a tough guy.
Yeah. Oh, he was.
Jean Raimbault was a priest at the outbreak of the French Revolution in France. He refused to swear allegiance to the king of to the new republic, to the new constitution of France. So he was considered as a prêtre réfractaire, refractory priest. And for these guys, they were really in danger during the time of the French Revolution. And happily for him, there was a sort of underground railroad to make them escape. These prêtres réfractaires, there was a way out of France through a sort of a secret network.
Through Belgium and England.
Through Duché de Brabant. That was not called really Belgium then. It was the Duché de Brabant, and then they could turn right to Holland or go straight ahead in Great Britain. So the King of England was stuck with a load of French priests, and they were all Catholics, and he was a keeper of the Anglican faith. But the Bishop of Quebec was out of priests. There was a growing population in the countryside of Lower Canada, and there was a lack of priests, of rectors for all these parishes. So about 50 of the prêtres réfractaires came to Canada. And the concentration was in the Trois-Rivières area. It was called La Petite France because there were so many French priests coming to the Canadian population. Because don't forget that, of course, there were people here French speaking, but they were not French. They were born in Canada. They were under the British regime. Like we say on our license plate, je me souviens que né sous le lys, j'ai grandi sous la rose. I remember that born under the lily, I grew up under the rose. So they were living and sometimes fighting, but it was at the Parliament. There was a sort of life here that was not like in France, and people here were very glad to be out of France for the revolution, because the revolution here had a very bad reputation.
So he was someone who was really holding on to his faith, and
yes.
He was a tough guy. So there was this conflict in Nicolet between Chandler and Raimbault. We had the English-French, we had the Protestant Catholic, which was the biggest thing. But an interesting dynamic too was that Raimbault wasn't born here and Chandler was.
Of course, you're proud of that. You're very proud of that.
I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, get it.
It's interesting.
Okay.
He was a Canadian-born Seigneur, Chandler. So there was this conflict, and Raimbault was not going to budge at all. And I don't know that Chandler's wife was trying to make a political statement. I think she just actually wanted to have communion. There were no Protestant priests around. Anglican.
It was the same God.
That's it. But Raimbault did not see it that way. So Chandler finally decided, I'm going to build my own church, which he did right here where we're standing. Right here, his manor house was further on. He built it. There were, I think, about 16 donors from Nicolet and Baie-du-Fèvre, and most of the money came from Chandler himself and from his young son-in-law, Thomas Trigg, who was also buried in this cemetery. And that's it. And this really upset Raimbault. He was extremely upset. He was upset to the point where he thought, am I going to forbid Catholic workers from working on building this heretic building? To that point. Also, once the church was built, he worried that Catholic children would be drawn into Sunday school. He thought that was a terrible thing. And he also banned all Catholics from getting anywhere near a funeral cortege or in the cemetery. I didn't quite get that. It's a bit strange. But there was a real conflict between Chandler and Raimbault. And Chandler just said, okay, I'll build my own church. And it was called, what was it called? St. Bartholomew's.
St. Bartholomew.
St. Bartholomew's Anglican Church. And he built it in 1824, and it was torn down in 1916. So Chandler died in 1850. His daughter was married to Thomas Trigg. They inherited the seigneury. They lived here and died here as well. And their descendants at that point were starting to move away. The English Protestant community, because there was an English Catholic community in the area as well, but the English Protestant community started to move away and disperse, and the church was really not being kept up, so it had to be sold, and it was torn down in 1916. And the stone was sold for...
L'École Normale, who opened in 1924 and who's been demolished, that's been demolished in 1966 because of the arduous soil of Nicolet.
Well, there was that big landslide, that destroyed so much
There's been a landslide in 55, but in 66, even if the École Normale was away from the site of the landscape, of the land, the glissement terrain, landslide. Of course, they had problems with the soil, and it's been demolished in 1966.
We're getting to this grave site and what happened, the scandal after he died, which was about 70 years after he's died, when the church was torn down because he was buried underneath the church, which was standing right here. So what to do with his body? What to do with his remains? Well, his body, 70 years later, his remains. And there was a big hullabaloo of what to do, what shall we do? A hullabaloo.
A hullabaloo.
A big kerfuffle.
Okay.
a big
A Luftballon.
A big upset. There was his grandsons, Arthur and Henry Trigg, and their aunt, Thomas Trigg's sister, Aunt Lizzie. So Aunt Lizzie Trigg was writing letters back and forth to all the bishops and everything. Like, what shall we do to protect his remains? Because there was no church here anymore, and what should we do? You know, he was the founder of a dynasty, or their ancestor. So I think it was her idea to pour concrete over it. Let's just encase his remains in a nice concrete tomb, and it'll last forever. Which, as we can see now, it isn't lasting forever. In fact, I think it was here several months ago, and it looks worse now than it did even then. And it looks a bit Victorian Gothic too. It's covered with moss, and it's chipped away. And one thing that's really sad is that his name is inscribed in stone on the end, but it's the end that's facing this hedge, and you can't even see who it is, who it was.
Of course, yes, it's a sort of disgrace for the heritage, the material heritage. But you should notice that when Chandler died in 1850, it was the very end of the seigneurial regime. He was the last landlord, because in 1855 the seigneurial regime was torn down, replaced by the municipal regime. There was there's been a sort of compensation for the landlord families, but land owning was over in Lower Canada.
Yeah, but that was the start of it. I think it took decades, because his son inherited the property. So
yes.
Thomas Trigg was still the seigneur, and his son Arthur was still the seigneur in 1916. Then Arthur was starting to get reparations in exchange for land. So that's another story too. We could just tell stories forever about Nicolet, couldn't we?
This is what we do now.
This is what we do. But this is such a beautiful location to tell them in, isn't it?
Yes, and it was even better before these buildings here, because there was a beautiful view on the Nicolet River. And now it's over. You have these buildings. You have this sort of gate and no. I prefer the way it was before, because it was really great. They'd done the same thing anyway with the Catholic cemetery, because there was an outlook on the river not so long ago, but now you have bungalows here, because people wanted to look to build there and have a look on the river, and now they have it, you know.
It's still a beautiful spot with all these old trees. So thanks a lot for joining me, Nicolet, to talk about Chandler and Raimbault.
It was my pleasure. On behalf of Jean Raimbault from Orléans, France, prêtre réfractaire.
On behalf of Ken Chandler, English Protestant seigneur of Nicolet.
Born in Lower Canada. Got it. Trinity College, King's College.
You're such a snob.
Yeah.
U of T. Mais au football, ils sont bons au hockey.
François, arrête. S'il vous plaît.
Shut up.
Clap, sync.